Catherine Elizabeth Windsor stood before the ornate mirror in her private chambers, her reflection showing a woman who had carried the weight of duty for decades. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, casting shadows across her face as she prepared for what would be one of the most difficult conversations of her life. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the simple pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, a gesture that had become second nature over the years of public appearances and royal obligations. The palace corridors echoed with the familiar sounds of morning routines, but today felt different. Staff members moved with hushed reverence, sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. Catherine had made her decision weeks ago, but announcing it to the family would mark the point of no return. She had watched her husband struggle with his own burdens, seen her children navigate the complexities of modern royalty, and witnessed firsthand how the institution had evolved over her years of service. William knocked softly on the door before entering, his expression concerned. He had noticed the change in his stepmother over recent months, the way she had begun declining certain engagements and spending more time in private reflection. Catherine had always been the steady presence in their family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and maintained harmony when tensions arose. Her relationship with William had grown strong over the years, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of their unique positions. "Are you certain about this?" William asked, settling into the chair across from her sitting area. His voice carried the weight of someone who understood the magnitude of what Catherine was contemplating. The conversation they had shared the previous evening had left him with mixed emotions, torn between supporting her personal happiness and worrying about the impact on the monarchy. Catherine nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the garden visible through the window. "I've given this considerable thought, William. The time has come for me to step back, to allow the next generation to take the lead while I pursue a different path." Her voice was steady, but those who knew her well could detect the underlying emotion. This decision hadn't come easily, but she had reached a point where her personal needs could no longer be secondary to duty. The weight of her words settled between them. William understood that Catherine's announcement would send shockwaves through not just their family, but the entire institution. She had become synonymous with grace and dedication, her public image carefully cultivated over years of faithful service. The idea of her stepping away from royal duties seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Meanwhile, in another wing of the palace, Camilla was reviewing the morning's correspondence when her private secretary mentioned seeing unusual activity around Catherine's quarters. The observation was casual, meant only as palace gossip, but it immediately caught Camilla's attention. She had always been acutely aware of her position within the family hierarchy and had worked tirelessly to establish her place alongside Charles. Any potential shift in that carefully balanced dynamic triggered her protective instincts. Camilla's relationship with Catherine had always been cordial but complex. Both women understood their roles and had managed to coexist professionally, but underneath the surface lay currents of competition and comparison. The public and media often contrasted their different approaches to royal duty, their styles, and their relationships with other family members. Camilla had fought hard for acceptance and recognition, and the thought of any change that might affect her standing created immediate anxiety. She dismissed her secretary and walked to the window, her mind racing through possibilities. Catherine's recent behavior had been noticed by others as well. The subtle changes in her schedule, the private meetings with William and Harry, the way she seemed to be tying up loose ends with her various charitable commitments. Camilla's instincts, honed through years of navigating complex social and political situations, told her something significant was brewing. The palace staff had begun to whisper among themselves, picking up on the unusual energy that seemed to permeate the building. Catherine's long-serving lady-in-waiting had been seen carrying boxes from the private apartments, and several trusted advisors had been requesting private audiences with her. These small details, individually insignificant, began to form a pattern that suggested major changes were imminent. Charles remained unaware of the gathering storm. His schedule had kept him occupied with state business, and Catherine had chosen her timing carefully, waiting for a moment when she could speak with the immediate family before word spread through other channels. She understood the importance of controlling the narrative and ensuring that those closest to her heard the news directly from her rather than through palace gossip or media speculation. As the morning progressed, Catherine made her final preparations. She had written personal letters to each of her major charitable organizations, explaining her decision and recommending suitable successors for her patronages. The process had been emotionally challenging, as these organizations represented years of passionate advocacy and personal investment. Each letter reflected her deep commitment to the causes she had championed and her desire to ensure their continued success without her direct involvement. Her private secretary had been sworn to secrecy while helping arrange the logistics of Catherine's announcement. The careful choreography required to manage such a significant revelation within the royal household demanded precise timing and absolute discretion. Every detail had been considered, from the order in which family members would be informed to the preparation of official statements for eventual public release. The gravity of the situation became increasingly apparent as Catherine reviewed her decision one final time. She thought about the young woman she had been when she first entered this world, the dreams and expectations she had carried, and how those had evolved over the years. Her journey had been marked by both tremendous privilege and significant sacrifice, moments of great joy and periods of intense scrutiny. William returned later that afternoon, accompanied by Harry, who had flown in from California upon receiving an urgent but cryptic message from his stepmother. The three of them sat in Catherine's private drawing room, the same space where countless family discussions had taken place over the years. The familiar surroundings provided some comfort as Catherine prepared to share her decision with both of her stepsons. Harry's arrival had not gone unnoticed by Camilla, who had been monitoring the unusual comings and goings throughout the day. Seeing both princes converge on Catherine's quarters confirmed her suspicions that something significant was happening. Her anxiety levels rose as she realized she was being excluded from whatever was taking place. The feeling of being on the outside of important family decisions triggered deep-seated insecurities about her position and acceptance within the royal circle. Catherine looked at both young men, seeing in their faces the boys they had been when she first entered their lives and the men they had become. Her relationship with them had been one of the most rewarding aspects of her royal role, and she knew that her decision would affect them deeply. They had come to rely on her wisdom and support, particularly during difficult periods in their own lives and relationships. "I've asked you both here because I want you to hear this from me directly," Catherine began, her voice calm but emotional. "After much consideration and soul-searching, I've decided to step back from my royal duties. This isn't a decision I've made lightly, and it's not about any single issue or person. It's about recognizing that I need to prioritize my own well-being and happiness in the time I have remaining." The silence that followed was profound. Both William and Harry had suspected this might be coming, but hearing it stated so clearly still came as a shock. They understood the implications immediately, not just for Catherine personally, but for the monarchy, the family dynamics, and the public perception of the institution they had all served. As the afternoon sun began to fade, the three of them continued their conversation, discussing the practical aspects of Catherine's decision and the timeline for its implementation. Outside, Camilla paced in her own quarters, her frustration and concern growing with each passing hour. The exclusion from whatever was happening in Catherine's rooms felt like a deliberate slight, and her imagination began to fill in the gaps with increasingly worrying scenarios. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the very foundations of the family's relationships and challenge their ability to navigate one of the most significant changes in their modern history. Catherine's goodbye was about to begin, and the ripple effects would touch every corner of their carefully structured world. The following morning brought an unexpected chill to the palace atmosphere. Catherine had requested a private family meeting, and the formal invitation delivered to each family member carried an unusual weight that couldn't be ignored. Charles received his notice while reviewing state papers in his study, the elegant script of Catherine's handwriting immediately capturing his attention. The request was politely worded but firm in its urgency, asking for his presence in the blue drawing room at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Camilla's invitation arrived with her afternoon tea, delivered by a footman who seemed unusually formal in his presentation. As she read the brief message, her hands began to shake slightly. The exclusion she had felt the previous day now made perfect sense, and the realization that she had been kept in the dark about something so significant filled her with a mixture of anger and fear. Her mind immediately went to the worst possible scenarios, each more threatening to her position than the last. The hours leading up to the meeting crawled by with agonizing slowness. Catherine spent the time in quiet preparation, reviewing notes she had made about how to present her decision and the reasons behind it. She had consulted with her closest advisors about the best way to handle the announcement, understanding that the family's initial reaction would be crucial in determining how smoothly the transition could proceed. Charles attempted to carry on with his normal routine, but found himself distracted and unable to concentrate on the documents before him. His relationship with Catherine had evolved over the years into something comfortable and mutually supportive, built on shared experiences and common understanding of their unique circumstances. The thought that she might be considering a significant change created an uneasiness he couldn't shake. Camilla found it impossible to maintain any pretense of normalcy. She canceled her planned afternoon engagements and spent the time pacing between her private sitting room and bedroom, trying to piece together the clues she had observed over recent weeks. The private meetings, the unusual correspondence, Catherine's subtle changes in demeanor, all of it now seemed to point towards something she should have seen coming, but had somehow missed. When 4 o'clock arrived, the family gathered in the blue drawing room with an atmosphere of tense anticipation. Charles sat in his usual chair, his expression serious but curious. Camilla positioned herself nearby, her posture rigid with barely contained anxiety. William and Harry, who already knew what was coming, tried to maintain neutral expressions while providing silent moral support to Catherine. Catherine entered the room last, her bearing as composed and dignified as always, but those who knew her well could see the underlying emotion in her carefully controlled expression. She had chosen her outfit deliberately, a simple but elegant navy dress that conveyed both respect for the occasion and her own sense of personal style. The pearl necklace remained at her throat, a tangible connection to the generations of royal women who had faced their own difficult decisions in these same rooms. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Catherine began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to share. "I've asked you here because I have an important announcement to make, something that will affect our family and our work going forward." She paused, gathering herself for the words that would change everything. "After much consideration and reflection, I have decided to step back from my royal duties and reduce my public role significantly." The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. Charles stared at her in shock, clearly blindsided by an announcement he had never seen coming. His face cycled through expressions of surprise, confusion, and something approaching hurt as he processed what Catherine had just said. The implications began to dawn on him, not just the personal loss of Catherine's partnership, but the institutional challenges her departure would create. Camilla's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her face flushed red as a surge of emotions crashed over her. Shock at the announcement itself, but more powerfully, rage at being excluded from the decision-making process. "You discussed this with the boys, but not with us," she demanded, her voice rising despite her attempt to maintain composure. "How dare you make such a decision without consulting the people who will be most affected by it?" The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. William and Harry exchanged glances, recognizing that the conversation was about to take a turn none of them had fully anticipated. Catherine remained calm, her years of experience in handling difficult situations serving her well. "I discussed it with William and Harry because I wanted their perspective as the next generation," she replied evenly. "This decision affects my life most directly, and I felt it was important to consider how it might impact their future roles." Camilla stood up abruptly, her carefully maintained royal composure beginning to crack. "Your life?" she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What about the monarchy? What about your duty? What about the impact on Charles?" The questions came rapid fire, each one delivered with increasing intensity. Years of suppressed feelings about her position within the family hierarchy suddenly found their voice. Charles attempted to intervene, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Let's all take a moment to process this calmly," he suggested, but his own shock was evident in his tone. He was struggling to understand not just Catherine's decision, but the fact that she had made it without consulting him. Their relationship had been built on communication and mutual respect, and this felt like a fundamental breach of that understanding. Catherine maintained her composure, but the hurt was visible in her eyes. "I understand this comes as a shock," she said, directing her words primarily to Charles. "I had hoped we could discuss the details and work together on a transition plan. This isn't about abandoning responsibility, it's about recognizing when it's time for change and having the courage to act on that recognition." Camilla laughed bitterly, a sound that seemed to echo off the formal walls of the drawing room. "Courage?" she repeated. "You call running away courage? You call abandoning your commitments and leaving the rest of us to pick up the pieces courage?" Her voice was rising again, and the careful control she had maintained for years in public settings was nowhere to be found. The attack felt personal and unfair to Catherine, who had dedicated decades of her life to royal service. "I'm not running away," she replied, her own voice becoming firmer. "I'm making a choice about how to spend the remainder of my life. I've given everything I could to this role, and now I need to step back and focus on my own well-being." William finally spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension. "Catherine has served with distinction for years," he said, looking directly at Camilla. "If she feels it's time to step back, we should respect that decision and support her in making the transition as smooth as possible." His words carried the weight of his future position and the implicit reminder of the hierarchy within the room. Camilla turned her anger toward William, her frustration finding a new target. "Easy words from someone who's never had to fight for their position?" she snapped. "You've never had to prove yourself over and over again, never had to work to earn acceptance and respect. Catherine's departure affects more than just her, it affects the entire balance of how this family functions." Harry, who had remained silent until now, stood up slowly. His own complicated relationship with royal duty gave weight to his words when he finally spoke. "Maybe that's exactly the point," he said quietly. "Maybe the balance needs to change. Maybe we all need to think more carefully about the cost of these roles and whether they're sustainable in the long term." The room fell silent again as the implications of Harry's words sank in. Charles looked between his sons and his wife, seeing his family fracturing before his eyes over an issue he had never anticipated having to face. The institution he had prepared his entire life to lead was being challenged from within, and he was struggling to find a path forward that could satisfy everyone. Camilla's anger reached a boiling point. "This is exactly what I was afraid would happen," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "The moment there's any real pressure, people start abandoning ship. Well, I've worked too hard and sacrificed too much to watch this family tear itself apart, because someone decided they don't want to do the job anymore." Catherine stood up slowly, her dignity intact, despite the verbal assault she was enduring. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Camilla," she said quietly. "I had hoped we could approach this as a family challenge to work through together, but I won't be bullied or shamed into changing my decision. I've made my choice, and I intend to stand by it." The confrontation had reached a point where emotions were overriding rational discussion. Charles could see that continuing the conversation in its current state would only cause more damage. "I think we all need some time to process this," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and disappointment. "Let's reconvene tomorrow when we've all had a chance to think through the implications and how we want to move forward." As the family members began to file out of the room, the damage to their relationships was already evident. Camilla's jealous rage had transformed what might have been a difficult but manageable family discussion into something much more destructive. The seeds of a deeper crisis had been planted, and the tremors were already beginning to spread through the carefully constructed world they had all worked so hard to maintain. The night that followed the explosive family meeting was one of the longest in recent palace memory. Sleep came fitfully, if at all, to the royal quarters as each family member grappled with the new reality Catherine's announcement had created. The morning brought no relief, only the harsh light of day illuminating the depth of the crisis that had erupted within the family's private walls. Catherine rose early and spent time in her private garden, a space she had cultivated over the years as a retreat from the pressures of public life. The roses she had planted were in full bloom, their beauty providing a stark contrast to the turmoil that had engulfed her personal world. She found herself thinking about the future she had envisioned. Quieter days spent pursuing personal interests, perhaps some writing, definitely more time with close friends who knew her as a person rather than a title. Camilla had barely slept, her mind churning through the implications of Catherine's decision and her own explosive reaction to it. In the cold light of morning, she could see that her behavior had been problematic, but the underlying feelings that had driven it remained unchanged. The thought of Catherine walking away from responsibilities that Camilla herself had fought so hard to earn felt like a personal betrayal of everything she had worked to achieve. Charles spent the early hours in his study trying to process both Catherine's decision and Camilla's reaction to it. His relationship with Catherine had been built on mutual respect and understanding, and her choice to step back, while surprising, was ultimately something he could accept. But Camilla's angry outburst had revealed tensions he hadn't fully recognized, and he found himself questioning how well he really understood the dynamics within his own family. The palace staff moved through their morning routines with unusual caution, sensing the tension that seemed to permeate the building. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones, and everyone seemed to be waiting for the other shoe to drop. The private secretaries found themselves in the delicate position of maintaining normal schedules while preparing for what might be significant changes to the royal household structure. William arrived at the palace mid-morning, having spent the night discussing the situation with his own family. His wife had offered valuable perspective on the challenges Catherine faced, and their conversation had reinforced his belief that supporting Catherine's decision was the right thing to do. He understood that the family would need to find a way forward that honored Catherine's choice, while preserving the institutional stability his father valued so highly. Harry had remained at the palace overnight, occupying one of the guest suites he had used frequently during his youth. His own experience with stepping back from royal duties gave him unique insight into what Catherine might be feeling, and he was determined to provide whatever support she needed during what was likely to be a difficult transition period. The second family meeting was scheduled for late morning, and the atmosphere as family members gathered was markedly different from the previous day. There was a wariness in the air, a recognition that the easy relationships they had previously enjoyed had been fundamentally altered by the events of the previous afternoon. Catherine entered the room with her characteristic poise, but there was a steeliness in her demeanor that hadn't been there before. The verbal attack she had endured from Camilla had strengthened her resolve rather than weakening it, and she was prepared to defend her position more forcefully if necessary. Camilla appeared subdued but unrepentant, her anger from the previous day having crystallized into a cold determination to protect what she saw as her rightful position within the family structure. She had spent the morning consulting with her own advisors about the implications of Catherine's departure and how it might affect her own role and responsibilities. Charles opened the discussion with an attempt to establish a more constructive tone. "I want to begin by acknowledging that yesterday's conversation didn't go as any of us hoped," he said, looking around the room at each family member. "But we're family, and we need to find a way to work through this together, respecting everyone's needs and concerns." Catherine nodded appreciatively at her husband's conciliatory approach. "I want to be clear about my intentions," she said. "This isn't about rejecting the family or the institution. It's about recognizing that I need to prioritize my own well-being while I'm still healthy enough to enjoy a different kind of life. I'm willing to work with everyone to ensure a smooth transition that minimizes disruption." Camilla's response was immediate and sharp. "Minimize disruption?" she repeated. "Catherine, your decision creates massive disruption no matter how we handle it. The public will ask questions, the media will speculate, and the institution's stability will be called into question. You can't just walk away from that responsibility." William leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "With respect, Camilla, Catherine has fulfilled her responsibilities admirably for decades. If she chooses to step back now, that's her right, and we should support her decision rather than guilt her into staying in a role she no longer wants." The exchange sparked something in Camilla that had been building since the previous day. "Support her decision?" she asked, her voice rising. "What about supporting the monarchy? What about supporting the family? What about supporting Charles?" She turned to her husband, her expression desperate. "Don't you see what this does to everything we've worked to build?" Charles found himself caught between his wife's passionate plea and his respect for Catherine's autonomy. "I want Catherine to be happy," he said carefully, "but I also understand Camilla's concerns about the impact on our work and our family unity." Catherine's patience, which had held remarkably well under pressure, finally began to show signs of strain. "Camilla, I understand that change is difficult," she said, her voice carrying a warning edge. "But I won't be manipulated into staying in a role that no longer serves my needs. My decision is final, and I expect it to be respected." The direct confrontation between the two women brought the underlying tensions fully into the open. Camilla stood up, her composure finally cracking completely. "Respected?" she shouted. "You want respect while you abandon your duties and leave the rest of us to deal with the consequences? You've had everything handed to you on a silver platter, and now when things get challenging, you just walk away." The accusation was deeply unfair, and everyone in the room knew it. Catherine had worked tirelessly during her years of royal service, often taking on the most challenging assignments with grace and effectiveness. William and Harry both started to respond, but Catherine held up a hand to stop them. "That's enough," Catherine said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that commanded attention. "I've listened to your concerns, Camilla, and I've tried to be understanding of your position, but I won't tolerate personal attacks or false characterizations of my service. If you can't discuss this respectfully, then perhaps you shouldn't be part of the conversation." Camilla's face went white with rage. The dismissal, delivered so calmly and with such finality, felt like the ultimate rejection of her position within the family. "Don't you dare tell me whether I belong in this conversation," she said, her voice shaking. I've earned my place in this family, and I won't be pushed aside by someone who's decided she's too good for the job." Charles finally stepped in with authority, his voice cutting through the escalating conflict. "Stop," he said firmly. "Both of you, stop this immediately. We're family, and we're going to act like it." He looked at his wife with disappointment clearly visible in his expression. "Camilla, your behavior is unacceptable. Catherine deserves better treatment than this." The rebuke from her husband hit Camilla like a physical blow. She had expected his support, or at least his understanding of her position. Instead, she found herself isolated and criticized, her fears about her place in the family seemingly confirmed by his reaction. Harry chose this moment to speak up, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had made similar difficult choices. "I think we're losing sight of what's really important here," he said. "Catherine has given decades of her life to public service. If she wants to step back and pursue her own happiness, that should be celebrated, not attacked." Camilla turned her fury on Harry, seeing him as another threat to the stability she had worked so hard to achieve. "Easy words from someone who walked away when it suited him," she snapped. "You have no idea what it takes to maintain this institution day after day, year after year." The attack on Harry was a bridge too far for William, who rose to his feet with obvious anger. "That's completely out of line," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his future authority. "Harry's choices were his own to make, just as Catherine's are, and both of them deserve our support, not our judgment." The room fell silent as the full extent of the family's fracture became clear. What had begun as Catherine's personal decision had spiraled into a crisis that threatened the very foundations of their relationships. Camilla stood alone in her opposition, her jealous rage having isolated her from the rest of the family. Charles looked around the room at his fractured family, seeing years of careful relationship building crumbling before his eyes. "I think we need some time apart," he said heavily. "Everyone should take some space to think about what's really important here and how we want to move forward as a family." Catherine gathered her composure and addressed the room one final time. "My decision stands," she said quietly. "I'll begin transitioning my responsibilities immediately. I hope that in time we can find a way to maintain our family relationships despite the changes that are coming." As the family members filed out of the room, the weight of what had transpired settled over them like a heavy blanket. Catherine's goodbye had become something much larger than a simple retirement announcement. It had exposed fundamental tensions within the family and raised serious questions about their ability to navigate future challenges together. Camilla's jealous rage had brought the family to the edge of something they might not be able to come back from. The institution they had all served would survive, as it had survived countless other crises throughout its long history. But the personal relationships that had sustained them through previous challenges had been severely damaged, and the path to healing seemed uncertain at best. In the days that followed, the practical work of managing Catherine's transition began. Official statements were prepared, charitable organizations were contacted, and the complex machinery of royal life was adjusted to accommodate the new reality. But beneath the surface efficiency of these arrangements, the emotional wounds inflicted during those two family meetings continued to fester, a reminder of how quickly even the most stable families could be brought to the brink by jealousy, fear, and the inability to accept change with grace.